All right. Well, we are back. We have Wally Zimolong coming on. Um, Wally, we can see you. You can hear me.
I can hear you great. Thank you.
Awesome. Sorry, I have to produce this little part on my own with some technical difficulties. I want to pick your brain because I was looking into what you're doing in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is near and dear to my heart, as I told you over email. I grew up in New Jersey, went to grad school in Pennsylvania at Villanova. So I've kind of seen how Pennsylvania has shifted from this red purple state into much more of a blue state. Like the old saying used to be that it's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. Uh, it still is in many ways, but it's definitely become more of a blue state in a lot of ways. And I was reading into a little bit about your case, and I want to let you explain it for yourself. Um, do I get this right that you have clients now, you have people you're representing who were told that they were allowed to reopen or going to be allowed to reopen, then they were then said you can't reopen, but now their competitors are going to be allowed to reopen in Pennsylvania?
So you need to understand uh, what a mess the business closure uh, program was for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I don't think it was a pleasant experience in any state, but the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania took a particularly ham-handed approach led by our governor, Democrat Tom Wolf, and what I like to call his sidekick, an individual by the name of Rachel Levine, who is our esteemed, and I say that in jest, Secretary of Health.
Yeah.
So on, I believe it was March 18th, the governor, on 3 hours' notice, tells every business that is, quote, non life sustaining that they need to close. And all life sustaining businesses could remain open. Unlike some places like California, which I've been tangentially involved with cases with, there wasn't a real effort to define what exactly life sustaining businesses were
Yeah.
as opposed to non life sustaining business. Instead, attached to the governor's executive order was a list of industries that the governor felt were life sustaining and were not life sustaining. And in fact, lawyers were considered non life sustaining. Gun shops were initially
Yeah.
considered non life sustaining. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, a day or two later, via a press release, the governor issued a statement saying, we're going to have this waiver program. So if you've been classified as a non-life sustaining business, you can apply for a waiver through the Department of Economic
Mm-hmm.
Development, and we'll let you operate. One of the problems with that was that in his Secretary of Health's concurrent business closure order, she said, without any scientific basis that I'm aware of, that non-life sustaining businesses were a vector of disease
Yeah.
and increased the spread and transmission of COVID-19. Now, how you could render that conclusion, I don't know, but that's the conclusion that was reached. So then they have this waiver process, and it's not determined in any way or articulated in any way how folks that were applying for a waiver that were so-called non-life sustaining businesses would be any less of a spread of disease than a business that didn't get the waiver.
Yeah.
42,000 businesses apply for the waiver. 7,000 get waivers, and then abruptly, the governor stops the waiver program.
Yeah.
Well, what turned out was there weren't any standards, there weren't any guidelines. They may as well have been throwing darts at a dartboard to approve these waivers.
Oh,
And as a
shocking.
result, yeah, as a result, folks like my clients did applied for waivers. They were denied, and then their competitors, in one instance, it's a competitor 3 miles away down the
Oh,
road, was granted a waiver. And these aren't, businesses that you would think would be some vector of disease. My chief plaintiff is a pool company. He's a small business owner. He sells pool chemicals and supplies so that you can keep your pool clean and sanitary,
yeah.
actually.
That's ironic because chlorine is one of the disinfectants that if you own
One
a
of the
pool, that's what you're recommended to make sure you definitely put into it. Talk a little bit. What other clients? As I know this is a class action. What other clients are you representing other than the pool company?
Well, we have a client that's a home inspector and a
Hmm.
client that is a real estate company who had similar experiences with the waiver program. They were denied waivers and had competitors granted. Now, what's ironic about it, and I don't know if my lawsuit had any play in this, but yesterday the governor abruptly changed course and allowed all real estate services,
Yeah.
including two of my clients, to operate on a rather limited basis.
Yeah, it's just incredible. On this podcast, when Joe and I are talking about this, we talk about how what this has shown is that the government has used this as an opportunity, like they always do, to pick winners and losers. And this is what this waiver program looks like. And I want to ask you, obviously, you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, but we've seen so many things from across the country where programs like this have been malicious. Do you have any indication that the people who've been denied and their competitors have been accepted? Do you have any indication that it's malicious, or do you just think it's that dysfunctional?
Well, I think it's one part incompetence and one part favoritism. Interestingly, the governor's family business, Wolf Home Products, was received a waiver to make cabinets for field hospitals. And
Oh,
as you know, there's not many field hospitals that are
yeah.
still operating in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or really anywhere throughout the country.
And why do
So
they need
his
cabinets?
I have no idea why they would need custom
Yeah.
made cabinets, but his business, and somebody I saw on social media posted a picture of a box truck with Wolf Home Products driving around the
Oh,
streets of Philadelphia. Doesn't, and I'm not aware of any field hospitals that need cabinets in the city of Philadelphia right now. So you have instances like that. You have instances where other political insiders had waivers granted, and in other cases, they were just I think picking names out of a hat. I really do, because
yeah.
there would be no possible way for them to have processed 42,000 applications in 10 days on
Yeah.
short staff. In the middle of At that point was the sort of the height of the pandemic. You're talking about the last 2 weeks in March and beginning of April.
So I saw. It's funny that Governor Wolf had a family business that got to stay open. I also saw that the health commissioner, whatever her name is, I don't even want to get into that, but that she apparently brought a family member out of a out of a nursing home.
It's
I mean,
this
it just.
this
I know it's
issue,
not. I
and
know it's not your case, but
uh,
it's
uh,
it's just. It seems
it's
like there's
important.
a pattern here.
Well, this is important, and it just shows to the incompetence. And let's face it, the my case involves economic harm and
Yeah.
incompetence, and economic harm could be, quite severe when you're talking about people's livelihoods. What the Secretary of Health did is criminal. She had one job, which is to protect the most vulnerable. And the most vulnerable, as we now know, are those that were in nursing homes.
Yeah.
And the Department of Health had a plan to protect those most vulnerable. And much like Governor Cuomo, she required nursing homes, when it was well known and documented, all the data and science
Yeah.
that they keep telling us to file on a daily basis agreed that nursing homes were like dry kindling for this disease. And she forced nursing homes to take COVID positive patients, which caused hundreds and hundreds of deaths. Now, if
Yeah.
that wasn't bad enough, the incompetence wasn't bad enough, the death caused by her incompetence wasn't bad enough. Knowing this was going to excuse me, she removed her mother from the nursing home and put her up in a luxury hotel.
Wow.
Now, if that doesn't shock the conscience of your listeners, Governor Wolf has doubled down and has just lauded his Secretary of Health and told everyone what a tremendous job she's doing, even in the face of this incompetency that has caused suffering and death to people's family members. There has been calls from the Department of Justice to investigate this situation. I hope that that occurs, because this is a story. I think Tucker Carlson's spoken
Yeah.
about it, to his credit. This is probably one of the most egregious instances of government insiders and their incompetency causing harm while
Yeah.
they benefit themselves. It's like something out of a third world communist
Oh, absolutely.
Soviet state.
Absolutely. You hear the stories of U.S. AID, food aid, getting to a country, and the leader makes sure he gets it and none actually gets to the people. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you're talking about, where she made sure to save her family member, and obviously her policies have led to so much death and so much suffering. Um, I want to ask you about this because I was looking, and it looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, Governor Wolf just vetoed 3 bills, and at
He
least two of
did.
them would have allowed businesses in what they're calling the red counties in Pennsylvania to reopen. Would that have helped any of your clients if he had signed those into law?
Uh, well, what happened was the General Assembly passed 3 bills, actually 4 bills, one of which he signed to allow bars to sell takeout
Yeah.
mixed drink alcohol. That one got signed. But the other were industry specific bills. One was for the real estate industry, one was for barbers and hair salons, and the other one was for car dealerships, I believe. And he vetoed all 3. And the interesting thing was, a few hours after he vetoed it, he issued an executive order that permitted realtors and those in the real estate industry to operate. So
Yeah.
he rejected the bill only to essentially give the industry what it was asking for in the bill. And this is sort of a pattern with this guy. You know, Mr. Hey, you're abandoning the fight. You're a coward if you open up.
Yeah.
You're a coward if you want to go against my word. Time and time again, he has shown, and I think there's a great think tank here in the Commonwealth called the Commonwealth Foundation, and
Hmm.
they have a graph up on their website of every bill, even predating the COVID era, that Governor Wolf initially vetoed, only to get to go back on and either pass another version of the bill or then just drop his opposition to it in some way. So Mr. The public is a coward. Is really a person in throwing stones
Yeah.
and acting in a totally different way when he's talking about legislation that he opposes.
Now, me being the cynic, I look at that and I say that if he has an executive order that essentially, at least for one of the bills, does the same thing, that tells me that he wants the power to vest with him and not with the legislature. It struck me through all of this where we have governors, we have county health officials, people who have never even been elected, deciding out of nowhere what's an essential business, what's a life saving business, what isn't. And then you see in Pennsylvania where the legislature passes a bill and he vetoes it. So one person can decide who can open, who can close, but it would take a super majority, a veto proof majority of the legislature to reopen it. That just seems insane.
Well, what's insane about it is the breadth of power that was seized by blue state governors under the guise of combating a pandemic. Now, getting back to sort of the legal history here, quarantine laws were something that were very familiar to our founders. Infectious disease was around, and the modes of combating infectious disease were around at the time of our founding, and some of them, social distancing and staying home and closing businesses, ironically, are the same types of mitigation
Yeah.
efforts that our founders would have imposed and stopping people from coming into the country. But historically, they've always been somewhat limited, limited to at least towns, never statewide. I mean, if you look at the history of quarantines with the yellow fever pandemics of the late 19th century, I mean, there were whole towns that were shut down in the South, but never statewide. And if you the basis for these laws is, hey, the sick should be separated from the healthy, and if we need to close down certain businesses to prevent the sick from traveling there, we need to keep the sick in their homes. That is what everybody agrees is acceptable. They've now taken that and pushed the boundaries on it beyond anyone's wildest
Yeah.
imaginations going into this, and anything that can be tangentially related and arguably something that could inhibit the spread of COVID-19. They have grasped on that and
Yeah.
used it to control almost every aspect of our lives. It's at least for those of us that are in these despotic blue states.
Yeah, and part of that is that this claim that, well, so many people don't have symptoms, so we have to presume that everyone's sick. That's what they're claiming. And I want to ask you this because I was looking at some of the interviews you've done with Breitbart, and it looks like you're making two arguments with your lawsuit, that it obviously it violates due process, and it violates the 14th Amendment.
Right.
To me, one of the biggest problems with all of these lockdowns is the due process is missing. As you mentioned, you quarantine the sick people. Well, there's no process for me to prove I'm not sick. They're presuming that I'm sick, that I'm not allowed to go outside. And they say, oh no, you can't get a test to prove to us that you're not sick. Right? You mentioned with your clients that you're allowed to apply, but there's actually really no process. No one's really telling you how it's decided who is allowed to open, who isn't allowed to open. It just seems like this is obviously it's a due process violation if everyone has to stay inside and you have no mechanism to prove that you're healthy and you deserve to go out. I mean, I don't even want to make that argument that you should prove that you deserve to go outside. But talk to us a little bit about the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment claims that you're making in your lawsuit.
So when you talk of due process, there's really two components of that. There's something called substantive due process, and the other is procedural due process. The notion of substantive due process flows from the Fifth and the 14th Amendments, and they both share a similar clause relating to life not being life, liberty, not being taken away without due process of law. Mm. And really what that means is that laws have to be fundamentally fair. They can't be arbitrary. There has to be uniform guidelines that everybody can follow and everybody knows how to conduct their affairs. And it can't just be willy-nilly. Whatever the government decides is wrong can be punished by the government. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It's a little bit – substantive due process is a little bit more nebulous than procedural due process, which I'll get into in a minute. But it basically gets down to, is this law fundamentally fair?
Yeah.
And when you relate it to these, at least in my case, related to these waivers, is it fundamentally fair to have no standards against which to judge waivers for businesses and have subjective standards apply based upon the reviewer rather than a uniform set of guidelines? Yeah. The example I give is, imagine your town had a building code or a zoning code, and there was no written code. It's whatever the zoning board likes.
Which is kind of what happens anyway, but you keep going.
Well, exactly. But you do have certain standards. Hey, you have to have 3 feet setback, or you can't build above this height. It can't be this many stories. So there are objective standards in zoning goes. Imagine if it was just like, we're not going to tell you what the objective standards are. You just come before us, and we'll decide based upon we would like that.
Yeah, no one would accept I don't need a tape measure. I'm just going to eyeball it.
I'm just going to eyeball it, and we don't have uniform standards, and there's no height restriction or anything like that. Procedural due process is whether or not the government, or how the government can deprive you of a property interest. And it's the process by which they do that. So typically speaking, there needs to be notice that, hey, we intend to take this property interest or fine you in a way or do something to you that is uncomfortable. And then there needs to be an opportunity to be heard. So then you have to appear before some adjudicative body. It could be a judge. It could be an administrative board. There's some argument put forth on both sides. Evidence is heard. And then this presumably neutral third party renders a decision whether or not you can be deprived of your property. You may have some appeals rights. You may not, depending on the nature of the property interest and the board and the process that's been given to you. And then there are certain circumstances with procedural due process where the government in emergency situations can dispose of what is known as the pre-deprivation hearing. They can actually take the property interest away from you, but it's very clear that the procedural due process clause of the 14th Amendment still requires you to have a hearing in a very short period of time after that property is taken away from you to make your argument and have somebody neutral determine whether or not the government was justified in seizing your property. So in my case, you also have that as well, because there are folks that their businesses have been taken away and they have no reason, they have no way of challenging it. There's been no process that's been afforded to anybody that's been declared a non-life sustaining business, whereby they could challenge the governor's order and
Yeah.
say, well, maybe you are a life sustaining business, or maybe you are one of these businesses that fits within the waivers. So there's a lot there. I'm trying to condense a lot in a
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
few minutes, but that's
Yeah.
generally what that means.
The equal protection clause, does that fall into that, or does that incorporate other issues beyond just due process?
So your
Because
equal protection clause, it's a clause that appears in the 14th Amendment alongside the due process clause. And the equal protection clause prohibits different classes of people being treated differently under the law when there's a lack of rational basis. Now, there's two subparts to the equal protection clause and whether or not a law violates it. If there's something called a suspect class, if class is based upon race, based upon religion, based upon, to a lesser extent, sex. If a law has a disparate impact on one of those, what we call suspect classes, the level of scrutiny that the courts will give is called strict scrutiny. It's the
yeah.
highest level of scrutiny. And the court's going to say, is this law narrowly tailored to meet a
Yep.
compelling state interest? That's the only time that that's going to survive that type of scrutiny. In every other basis or case where there is a disparate treatment of a class of individuals, and they're not one of these suspect classes of the kind I just said, it's going to be given a rational basis review. So there still has to be some rational reason
Yeah.
that the government needs to show that two groups are being treated differently. Now, because in every case,
Is
you can
that
find
intermediate scrutiny, or is that a lower
no,
standard?
it's a lower standard. It's a lower standard, but the courts they're essentially going to look at it and say, is there some conceivable reason that there could be, the government can articulate that logically could justify the disparate treatment between these two seemingly equal individual or classes of people. Rational basis is something that the government almost certainly wins on. It's a tough one to argue against, much to the chagrin of attorneys like me. But in this case, in my case, when you really have two identical businesses that conduct themselves in every identical manner, identical customers, identical geographic area, logically explaining why one business would be able to conduct themselves in a manner that is not a vector for COVID-19, while my client couldn't, is going to be a tortured exercise for the Commonwealth. And
Yeah.
even on the low standard of review that rational basis is, I have a hard time seeing a court agreeing with him on that.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about how the gun store closures were early. I remember reading that the state Supreme Court, correct me if I'm wrong, actually upheld
Yeah,
originally that order.
it's interesting. The state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania is controlled with a Democratic majority, but they sometimes throw you a curveball. And they did so on the case that was before them regarding whether closures of gun stores under the guise that they were non-life sustaining was valid under not only the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, but the corresponding amendment to the Pennsylvania Constitution, which what some would say grants broader firearms protections to the United States Constitution. And it was almost exclusively the Democratic. There was, I believe, five in the dissent. Four Democrats, excuse me, it was a 5-4 opinion, and four Democrats joined together and said, we think this is a constitutional right. It's protected under the Second Amendment. We think Governor Wolf should take another look at this, and he did. And I think it was a day or two later he reversed himself.
Yeah, I remember, because when I went to school in Pennsylvania, I was living in New Jersey, and I would commute to Philly for night classes. So I got a concealed carry permit from the state of Utah, because New Jersey wouldn't give me one. And at the time, the Utah permit was honored by Pennsylvania. That is no longer the case. So I had to learn all of the different Pennsylvania gun laws to make sure I wasn't going to accidentally end up in jail. And something that they teach you when you go through the course, if you tell them that you're going to be carrying in Pennsylvania, is that during a state of emergency, open carry rights in Pennsylvania disappear. So in Pennsylvania, I don't know how much you know about the firearm laws. In Pennsylvania, a city of the first class, which is Philadelphia, I think it might still be Pittsburgh, but they're teetering on it. They might still count it as a city of the first class. You can't open carry there without a permit. You can open carry everywhere else in the state without a permit. But during a state of emergency, that open carry right without a permit goes away.
That's interesting. I'm not an expert
Yeah.
on firearm laws, but I know there was an issue. There was a bill that came up following Hurricane Katrina, when there was some cases brought by the National Rifle Association down in Louisiana because there were suspensions of firearms
Yeah.
rights that were related to the various states of emergency in that situation. And out of that, I seem to recall that there was some legislation because the Assembly in Pennsylvania is very pro Second Amendment. I seem to recall there was some legislation that came out of that. I don't know where it went. That I think attempted to blunt some of the powers of state and local officials in the time of a disaster or an emergency to suspend Second Amendment
Yeah,
rights. And
I know that they got rid of like the ability to confiscate people's guns, but to my
right.
knowledge, because I've talked to friends who don't have a concealed carry permit because they live
Hmm.
in Central PA, and
Sure.
they just would open carry, and now they make sure that they don't when they go into town,
Wow.
because of these emergency powers. I mean, it just goes to show how broad emergency powers are once they're declared and how hard it is to get them back. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I have a last couple questions. The first, we've seen with the most recently with the Supreme Court with the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City, we saw that after New York City, it was for the listeners, it was a case challenging New York City's law that said you couldn't bring a gun outside unless you had a specific reason. You couldn't bring it to a second home outside the city. You couldn't bring it hunting outside the city. You couldn't bring it to a shooting range. So there was a challenge on whether it's constitutional for the state to say you can't bring outside. New York City and New York State amended their law to try and escape a nationwide precedent. And what ultimately happened was the Supreme Court ruled that the issue was moot because the plaintiffs had already gotten what they wanted. Now, you mentioned that one of your clients is in the real estate business, and you mentioned that the governor just allowed them to start doing business again, at least in some capacity. Are you just fighting a lawsuit to reopen, or are you fighting for damages? Is it possible for the state to render your case moot by looking at your list of plaintiffs and saying, okay, you can reopen, you can reopen, you can reopen? Or are you fighting for damages? Because to me, the biggest thing about this is not just getting businesses reopened, but ensuring that this can never happen again. And if someone abused their power, I don't want to see them run away and get away with it because the case is moot because they've all of a sudden approved the permits.
So there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing is the situation that you're describing is something that falls underneath what's called the voluntary cessation doctrine. And generally speaking, if a state actor changes their course of conduct in the face of a lawsuit and voluntarily ceases their offending activity, the lawsuit is not rendered moot. Now, and it's something that I believe it was Justice Kavanaugh brought up in his dissent.
Yeah.
I think one of the exceptions is, hey, if the law is changed in such a way that they've given you everything you've wanted and there's no real possibility that they could then re-engage in their offending activity, then it's not, the voluntary cessation doctrine doesn't apply. And I think in the New York Rifle and Pistol Club case, since the law was affirmatively changed, it was tough for them to argue that, well, as soon as this lawsuit is over, they could go back to their old malfeasant ways. Now, here, there hasn't been any indication that the governor would go back and engage in his offending activity again if he felt that he decided tomorrow that real estate was a vector of disease. So we have a very strong argument that the voluntary cessation doctrine does not moot out our lawsuit. When you look in the terms of standing and mootness, you also have to look to when the what was the position of the plaintiff when the injury occurred. And when
Yeah.
the injury occurred here and we filed our lawsuit, there was offensive conduct. And just because you, as I said, you cease your offensive conduct in the face of a lawsuit doesn't necessarily moot that. Now, I don't know how many government attorneys know that, because we frequently are met in the face of constitutional challenges with attempts to moot the lawsuit. And it doesn't sound like they're too familiar with the voluntary cessation doctrine. That's understandable. Not many people are. So I'm fairly confident that Governor Wolf's recent actions are not going to moot my lawsuit, because we don't want it to happen to again. Now, one of the things we're seeking, which goes to another point that you mentioned, are we seeking money damages? There's 11th Amendment immunity here, and for your listeners, under the 11th Amendment, there are very limited circumstances when you can obtain money damages from a state. Now, local and county officials are different, but under the 11th Amendment, they have general immunity unless the state has waived it. They have not waived it for violations of constitutional rights. But under a 1908 Supreme Court decision called Ex parte Young, you could obtain injunctive relief and not run afoul of 11th Amendment immunity when that injunctive relief seeks to vindicate or prevent the continuation of violation of federal rights, including constitutional rights. So the whole purpose of our lawsuit is to stop this conduct from continuing in the areas that it is still continuing, to make sure that we get injunctive relief, that it does not happen again, doesn't come back in this mythical second wave, which always which has its own issues.
Yeah.
And that the governor can't act this way whenever he decides that it's necessary to declare some other form of emergency. God forbid. I could probably think we could probably take the next half hour thinking of hypotheticals of left-wing wish lists, which they want to declare emergencies on and use these same sweeping powers.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's good that you're thinking through that and that you have those arguments based, because there's no doubt in my mind that the state's going to try and, I mean, we see it with Second Amendment cases, we see it with other civil rights violation cases, that, okay, you're suing because you didn't get a permit, we're going to give you the permit, and then they try and render the case moot. So it's good that you're fighting to make sure that not only do your clients get relief, but that the violative actions that you're fighting against get some injunctive relief as well. Quickly before we wrap this up, are you looking for more members to join your class?
We have pretty much every industry covered, and I shouldn't say every industry covered. We have a good cross section of industries covered. And since it's a class, what we're hoping for is that the court will certify our class, which will cover any industry or any business which was applied for a waiver, denied a waiver, and then had a competitor granted a waiver. So that's the whole purpose. One of the purposes, in fact, of the class action is to present this mootness argument, to say, well, they can't just pick off the one named plaintiff. Your Honor, I still have an entire class of individuals that are harmed by this, and unless they want to cease their offending conduct against every class, every individual in the class, which they're probably not going to do, because that would be a complete reversal of their shutdown orders in many regards. So at this point, we have what we need to proceed, and we feel comfortable with that. Always things could change if circumstances arise, and we learn of people that were denied, that are particularly compelling stories where people that applied for waivers and had competitors that were granted waivers. We'd always be happy to talk to those folks.
Okay. And you filed this lawsuit in federal court. Do you have a court date set yet? Have you drawn a judge? Do you know who you're going to be arguing before potentially?
No, we do. We're in front of Judge Barclay Surik, who's a well-known judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania that I've had cases for before. A very learned judge, very very thorough judge, and which we're happy with. Really, anyone in the Eastern District are terrific as far as their legal intellect. We're actually still trying to make service of the complaint on the state actors. None of them are Republican Assembly and our Republican Senate. They're all in Harrisburg getting work done.
Yeah.
But the governor he's with, I I think he's with Joe Biden in the basement somewhere. I have no
Yeah.
idea. I say that half jokingly, but
He's
it's
feeding the geese in the backyard.
some nobody knows where he is. And one of the PA senators was on yesterday saying we do not know where he is. We don't know if
That's
he's
interesting.
we don't know if he's at his home. He's got two homes.
Yeah.
We don't. And same with the Secretary of Health. So certain state officials are there. They're working hard for
Uh-huh.
the like our Republican elected officials here in Pennsylvania. They're working hard for the citizens of Pennsylvania. But the two main folks that are I call him the Wizard of Oz because
Yeah.
he doesn't have live press conferences. He
Oh, those
pre-records.
aren't live?
They're not live. There's no
Oh.
press there. This is crazy. I can't believe more of the First Amendment and press types don't latch onto this. They pre-record these conferences. There are questions allegedly submitted by the press.
Of
His
course.
chief of staff reads him the question, which he probably had a chance to review in advance to prepare
Yeah.
his answer. He stares into a camera. He reads it. He reads it off. I mean, people probably think I'm exaggerating or being,
No, it's political theater.
a fringe element person when I say
Yeah.
I feel like I'm living in some second-rate, third-rate banana
Yeah.
republic, or some futuristic dystopian novel where our leaders are projected to us through these video screens. I mean, people compare him to a robot, and I suggest you don't take any more than 30 seconds because I'd be inflicting harm on you. But take a look at some of the press conferences that him and his health secretary put on a daily basis.
That's what I was going to say. Before you told me that these were not live, I would say, how great would it be to have a process server get him there? But he's not even holding them live. So you can't even serve him on camera.
I don't even, exactly. And trust me, I would. But I don't even know what basement he's broadcasting from.
Oh, that's incredible. Can you serve someone else in his staff, or does it have to be him?
Well, we have four defendants. We have the governor. We have the Secretary of Health. We have the head of the Department of Economic Development, who was ostensibly in charge of granting these waivers. And then we have the acting commissioner for the Board of Professional and Licensing Standards or Occupational Standards. I forget the exact name of it. And we're trying to make service on all of these officials, and none of them are apparently in Harrisburg, and we don't know where they are. But we'll find them eventually.
Do you think
effectuate service.
Do you think they're in the state, or do you think they might have left the state?
I have no idea, and I haven't heard anything.
That's been some rumors, not necessarily in Pennsylvania, but like with Illinois. The reports out that the governor and his family might have been leaving the state when they weren't letting anyone else. It'd be interesting if find out they're actually in the state. I can't imagine that a federal court would let them play those games for too long.
They won't. And we know the attorney generals, and the attorney generals have agreed for them to accept service, but I want to serve them. But you'll get a kick out of this, Max, as a New Jersey native, which I am as well.
What part?
Is South Jersey, Camden County.
Okay.
So the Governor Murphy, who would have pegged it that he has sort of more of a, he's opened up more than Governor Wolf. I never would have had that in the odds, but obviously this is a big weekend coming up, and many folks and not only New Jersey but southeastern Pennsylvania are going to flock to the Jersey Shore. And thank God Governor Murphy has come to his senses and has allowed the beaches to open in some semblance of what you can imagine for Memorial Day weekend. And the governor was asked, will you go to the shore? And he's like, oh, I will not be going to the shore. You're going to bring back COVID. It's very dangerous to go to the beach. So the irony there is I doubt that the governor is out of state because of his comments that apparently every other state is radioactive. I mean, it's completely ridiculous.
Heat, humidity, and sunlight kill the virus, but don't you dare go to the beach. You're a coward. You're a coward if you go to the beach. Well, it was great talking to you. Where can people go if they want to find press releases? Do you have a website where people could be able to go as you release press releases about this case?
Sure. Yeah. You can follow me on my website, which is zimolonglaw.com, ZIMOLONGLAW.com. I'm on Twitter at Wally Zimolong and Facebook under Wally Zimolong as well. And I try to be active on the social media channels, letting people know about what's going on in the case and commentary on other emergency actions, not only from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but some other governors that I think run afoul of various constitutional principles.
Oh, well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. If you ever do find a way to serve the governor, we'll definitely have you on to talk about it. And as your case moves forward, we'd love to hear an update in the future. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I'd be honored to come on and talk more about the case as it matriculates to the court system.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
All right, take care.